In these shots, an electrical substation in the Moscow region is on fire, the result of a brilliant and precise Ukrainian strike. The consequences are no less satisfying. Districts of the Russian capital were suddenly plunged into darkness. Lyubertsy is covered in black smoke, and together with it, the city of Koterniki was left without electricity. Meanwhile, a real and irreversible collapse has already begun in the minds of Russians themselves and even among Putin's elites. What exactly drove Russian citizens to a state of animalistic hysteria and made them beg for mercy? We reveal all the details right now. When will the special military operation end? Now, this is the main question on Yandex. More than 130,000 Russians are frantically searching the engine, and this is only the beginning of the 40-day SBU operation. So what awaits Putin's Federation next? And once again, Ukrainian drones have punched a major hole in Russian air defense and are now freely attacking Moscow and other cities. Against the backdrop of blaring sirens and a severe gasoline crisis, local residents are collectively losing their minds, frantically searching for bomb shelters, hoarding food, and demanding Putin's resignation. Is this a parallel universe or a new reality? The Kremlin was not prepared for this. But the Moscow elites have also broken down. Putin's inner circle is already doing this openly. How is the dictator's system coming apart at the seams? We are revealing all the shocking details right now. Greetings! This is the channel Ukraine Today. Andrei Silakov here with some good news. Ukrainian drone forces have unleashed real hell on the occupiers, punching a gaping hole in the much-vaunted air defense system on the way to Moscow. In the course of the brilliant Polyphemus operation, our operators burned out Russian radars in the Bryansk region, opening an unobstructed corridor for long-range strikes. The result turned out to be fatal for the residents of the Federation.
Russia's leaky air defense is not a social media myth and not a coincidence. Strikes on targets in St. Petersburg, Ust-Luga, and Moscow are only possible thanks to the open corridor in the enemy's dense air defense system. Operators from the Ironi Group of the 1st Separate Center of the 14th Regiment of the Strategic Action Unit are systematically destroying SKPP radars in the Bryansk region, which control the airspace in the direction of Russia's capital.
And the transformation of Moscow into a so-called frontline city has provoked genuine primal fear among Russians. Residents of the capital region are frantically flooding search engines. Interest in drones has increased almost fivefold, reaching an incredible 785,000 searches, while searches for bomb shelters have tripled. The war that they had cheerfully supported for years on television has come back to their homes, and now the citizens of the aggressor country are rapidly losing their minds from nightly explosions and power outages.
According to Yandex WordStat, in May 2026, the query bomb shelter was searched 33.7 thousand times in Moscow and the Moscow region. In January 2025, there were 10.5 thousand such searches, and in February, 9.1 thousand. Thus, in a year and a half, interest in the topic has grown more than threefold. Interest in drones has grown even more sharply. Among residents of the capital region, the query UAV in May 2026 reached 785,000 searches, compared to 163,000 in January 2025 and 130,000 in February of the same year. In a year and a half, the number of searches increased almost fivefold.
The psychological breakdown of Russian society has reached its historical peak. In just 1 week, residents of the Russian Federation entered more than 137,000 queries into Yandex with a single question: when will the special military operation end? This is the absolute maximum for the entire period of the full-scale invasion. Russians have completely fallen apart. It only took a series of intense airstrikes on their territory for the imperial euphoria to instantly turn into mass depression and pleas for an end to the hostilities.
In the week from June 22nd to June 28th, residents of Russia made more than 137,000 queries on Yandex about ending the special military operation in Ukraine, according to statistics from the Russian search engine analyzed by We Can Explain. This is the absolute maximum for the entire war with Ukraine, which coincided with the gasoline crisis.
The digital panic is being greatly intensified by the severe fuel crisis that has engulfed Russia due to the systematic destruction of oil refineries. Prices for gasoline and diesel are breaking 20-year records, and the Russian government, out of fear, is simply classifying statistics on fuel costs.
Drone attacks by the Ukrainian armed forces on oil refineries have caused an unprecedented fuel shortage. During the week from June 15th to June 21st, gasoline production in Russia dropped by 25% compared to last year's figures, Reuters reported. It is now impossible to refuel freely in the vast majority of regions. The number of such regions is growing every day. Just in the past 2 days, 11 more regions have reported difficulties with gasoline and the introduction of sales limits. Limits of 40 liters of gasoline and 80 liters of diesel per vehicle have been introduced at gas stations in the Khanty-Mansi Autonomous Okrug, even though about 40% of all Russian oil is produced in this region.
Meanwhile, the out-of-touch head of the Federation Council, Valentina Matvenko, cynically advised impoverished and frightened Russians to endure this collapse without sighs and groans.
They are working on it. I won't go into details right now. We will get out of this difficult situation, which, as is clear, has been created for us deliberately, and we know by whom. We shouldn't dramatize, shouldn't sigh and moan, but instead look for solutions together.
But the most telling plea for ending the war is now being openly voiced at the very highest level. The head of Sberbank, Herman Gref, publicly admitted at a shareholders' meeting that the swiftest possible end to the hostilities is the main issue that absolutely everyone is concerned about.
What concerns us? I think we are all concerned about the same thing. I don't think there is anyone in the country who is worried about anything other than the swiftest possible end to the hostilities. That's obvious.
Less than 3 minutes after the post with the quote was published, it was quickly deleted from the RBC channel. About an hour and a half later, the publication somehow reposted these words. And on the RBC website itself, the news remained accessible the entire time. And even though panicked propagandists were frantically deleting this quote from news feeds, the fact remains, the Kremlin elites are just as terrified as the 81% of the population who dream that this war will end, I quote, as soon as tomorrow.
According to the Kiev Institute for the Analysis of Russia, as cited by Medusa, 81% of Russians support ending the war as soon as tomorrow. This is the highest figure since the start of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine.
The first days of the 40-day campaign announced by Zelensky turned into total chaos for Russia, with explosions and massive blackouts. While Putin tells fairy tales about stability, a wave of heavy strikes has already reached the very heart of Moscow. Russians are literally losing their minds from panic. They are frantically searching for bomb shelters and flooding search engines with pleas for the war to end. If the Russian system has already collapsed so loudly at the very beginning, what will happen on the 10th or 40th day of Ukraine's countdown? You can see all the details of this route right now in our report.
The countdown has begun. Putin has been given 40 days. After Volodymyr Zelensky's announcement of a special operation to influence Russia, the Kremlin hardly expected such an explosive start. While Russian propaganda once again talks about reliable protection and full control over the situation, explosions have rocked one of the most important enterprises of the Russian military-industrial complex in Volgograd. And this was not just a warehouse with canned goods or an abandoned base on the outskirts. The Titan barricades plant was hit, a true pride of the Russian defense industry. It was here that components were produced for the Iskander, Yars, Topol-M missile systems and even for the Kremlin's much-publicized Oreshnik. In other words, we are talking about an enterprise that directly serves the Russian missile program. The most interesting thing is that the facility is located about 400 kilometers from the Ukrainian border. This creates a rather awkward situation for the Russian leadership. On the one hand, Putin assures the public that all threats are supposedly under control. On the other, Ukrainian strikes are already reaching facilities that Moscow until recently considered to be deep in the rear. According to available information, the strike hit 3 production workshops. One of them has sustained serious damage. That was where the Mechanical Assembly Division was located, where key components for Russian missile systems were assembled. As a result, one of the sections was affected, without which the entire production chain begins to operate much more slowly. The situation looks especially ironic against the backdrop of the Kremlin's constant claims that sanctions are not working and that Russia's defense industry is only gaining momentum. It turned out that imported high-tech equipment was actively used in the production of Russian weapons. But now the problem isn't even the origin of the machines. The problem is that the workshop where they were located will have to be restored after a highly unpleasant encounter with Ukrainian strike systems. And here the main question arises, if this is only the beginning of that very 40-day campaign, what will happen next? After all, the Kremlin is already forced to patch holes on several fronts at once. Somewhere oil depots are burning, elsewhere airports are being restored because of drones, and in other places there are problems with logistics and fuel. And now, strategic defense enterprises are also starting to appear in emergency reports. The Russian system is gradually shifting into a mode of continuous response to new crises. Not planning, not development, not preparing new offensives, but rather constant firefighting, both literally and figuratively. And with every new strike, Moscow gets yet another problem that must be urgently addressed. For the Kremlin, this is especially painful because such attacks destroy the main myth of Russian propaganda, the myth of the absolute safety of the rear. When explosions occur hundreds of kilometers from the border, when enterprises involved in the missile program are hit and strategic factories are forced to halt operations, it becomes increasingly difficult to talk about stability. That's why while Moscow counts the percentage of successfully intercepted targets, it seems a completely different countdown has begun on the Ukrainian calendar. And every day of this campaign may bring new surprises for the Kremlin, and most importantly, remind the Russian leadership of a simple truth. The longer the war continues, the closer its consequences come to the very heart of the Russian military machine. It seems that the problems of the Russian defense industry now begin not only from the sky, but also within their own factories. While the Kremlin boasts about record-breaking drone production rates, events may have occurred in Alabuga itself, the main assembly center for Russian Shaheds, that are unlikely to please anyone in Moscow. According to the resistance movement, Ukrainian agents have been carrying out sabotage operations over the past month directly at the facility where strike drones for the Russian army are assembled. And we're not talking about loud explosions or fires. A much more dangerous scenario for the occupiers could be when problems begin only after the drone has left the factory gates. It is reported that dozens of surprises have been embedded in the new batches of drones capable of disabling the equipment during operation. For the Russian military, this is essentially the worst possible scenario. After all, it's one thing when a drone fails to take off at the testing ground, and quite another when a malfunction occurs during combat use, when it is assigned a specific mission and results are expected. For years, the Kremlin has been convincing the public that Alabuga has become a true war conveyor belt, capable of churning out drones by the thousands. But now an extremely unpleasant question arises. If saboteurs really manage to infiltrate one of the most important elements of the Russian military machine, just how reliable is this entire conveyor belt? And that's not all. According to the underground resistance, information was also obtained about the personnel involved in the production of drones for the Russian army. And this means that the problems could go far beyond just a few defective products. After all, when the enemy obtains information about production chains and key personnel, the entire system is put at risk. While the Russian authorities are preparing to repel attacks from drones, missiles, and naval unmanned vehicles, problems may arise where they are least expected, right inside their own factories. And if previously in Moscow there were fears of strikes on defense enterprises, now there is also a need to worry about what is happening behind their fences. Very difficult times are coming for the Russian military machine. Some factories are suffering from attacks, others from logistical problems. And now there are reports that even finished products can bring unpleasant surprises to their own customers. And if this information is confirmed, it will become one of the most painful signals for the Kremlin. Problems are beginning to accumulate not only at the front, but also in the very heart of the Russian military-industrial complex.
And while the Kremlin desperately feeds Russians television fairy tales, Moscow is officially turning into a dangerous frontline zone. Ukrainian drones regularly break through the leaky air defense, strategic facilities are going up in flames one after another, and frightened Muscovites wake up every night to explosions and frantically search for shelter. No matter how much Putin lies that everything is under control, the harsh reality of war has burst painfully and loudly right into the apartments of the residents of Russia's capital. My colleague has shared the hottest details. Don't miss it.
Moscow can no longer pretend that the war is somewhere far away. What for years was shown to Russians on TV as someone else's misfortune has suddenly started knocking on the windows of the country's most expensive neighborhoods. The capital, accustomed to living with the confidence that it is protected by the most advanced air defense systems and an endless military budget, has been confronted with a very unpleasant reality. Drones keep coming again and again, and residents are waking up more and more often not to alarm clocks, but to explosions and the roar in the sky. What especially worries Muscovites is that, at the critical moment, there is silence. The sirens are silent and no warnings are issued. People only learn about the danger when they hear the distinctive sound of engines over their homes or when anti-aircraft systems start operating in the sky. And this is where the main question arises. If the capital of the largest country in the world has come under attack, why haven't the authorities explained even the most basic safety rules to citizens? It turned out that Moscow, which for decades was presented as the center of a mighty superpower, is absolutely unprepared for life under the threat of air attacks. People are searching for shelter maps on their own, exchanging addresses in chats and forums, calling officials, and trying to figure out where to run in case of another attack. But instead of clear answers, they often encounter a bureaucratic maze. In some districts, information is concealed, while in others, they advise people to come to the administration offices in person. It gives the impression that finding a safe place in the capital is much harder than finding yet another propaganda story about total control over the situation. Meanwhile, it is the sky over Moscow that is increasingly becoming a source of fear. The Russian air defense system, which for years was showcased at parades as a symbol of invincibility, is now forced to operate directly over residential neighborhoods. Debris falls to the ground, explosions go off near homes, and residents watch all of this from their balconies and courtyards. This is especially telling against the backdrop of years of Kremlin statements about the absolute safety of the capital. What causes even greater outrage is the authorities' response after the attacks. Instead of explaining to people how to act during times of danger, officials from the security agencies focus on fighting information. Posts, photos, and videos of the strikes become a bigger irritant for the system than the strikes themselves. It gives the impression that the main objective is not to protect the population, but to maintain an image of calm on television screens. Against this backdrop, the gap between ordinary Muscovites and the Russian leadership becomes especially noticeable. While some people in the middle of the night lead their children into bathrooms away from the windows and try to figure out where to find shelter, others continue to live behind the high fences of closed residences. For ordinary residents, the attacks have become part of everyday life. For the political elite, they still remain something distant, existing only in reports and press releases. And at the same time, Moscow presents a strange contrast. In one part of the city, people read news about new strikes, check neighborhood chats, and listen intently to every unfamiliar sound. In another, social events, flashy presentations, and parties continue as if someone is stubbornly trying to prove that nothing is happening. But each new attack shatters this illusion more and more. Today, the main fear of Muscovites is not even the drones themselves. What frightens them most is the realization that the system, which for years promised absolute protection, turned out to be unprepared for the test. And after each new explosion in the capital, more and more people are asking themselves the same question. If the authorities cannot guarantee safety in the very heart of Russia, then how truthful were all the other promises made by the Kremlin? And in the Kremlin, they haven't even changed their tune. It seems as if there exists some kind of parallel reality there, where oil depots don't catch fire, there are no fuel shortages, and drones reaching the Russian capital have no impact whatsoever. This is exactly the picture Putin painted in yet another conversation with the court propagandist Zarubina. While the entire country witnesses regular strikes on strategic facilities, the president of Russia insists all protective measures are in place, the system is working, and the problems are not critical. If you translate from Kremlin speak into plain language, it goes something like this. There's not enough gasoline, but there's no shortage. Facilities are burning, but there's almost no damage. Drones are arriving, but they have no effect whatsoever. It seems that the main task of the Russian authorities today is not to solve the problem, but to convince the population that the problem doesn't exist. The Kremlin is even trying to portray the fuel crisis as part of a Ukrainian information operation. Lines at gas stations are not a shortage, and supply disruptions are not a problem. Strikes on energy facilities are nothing serious. Everything is operating steadily and with a huge margin of safety. At least, that's what they say.
But the longer this charade goes on, the harder it becomes to hide the obvious. If all the defense systems are working flawlessly, then why are Moscow residents waking up to explosions? If the strikes don't matter, then why do the authorities react so nervously to every video of an impact? If the fuel situation is under control, then why publicly explain to the population that there are only a few days of reserves left? But the most ambitious part of the speech wasn't even the stories about the economy or air defense. Putin once again spoke about major offensives, future conquests, and victories. From the Kremlin offices, everything looks extremely simple. There are only a few kilometers left to one city, even less to another, just a little more, and yet another Ukrainian defense line will supposedly collapse. There is only one inconvenient detail in these statements. Most of these kinds of forecasts have been repeated by the Russian leadership for many months, and in some cases, for years. The more difficulties accumulate within Russia itself, the more grandiose the promises become on television screens. While Muscovites are searching for bomb shelters, they are being told about the future capture of new territories. While the regions are facing fuel shortages, they are being told that the enemy will soon be surrounded. While drones are reaching strategic targets, they are being shown a picture of absolute control. This is precisely the main paradox of Russia today. The real country is increasingly confronted with the consequences of war. The television country continues to live in a world of endless victories, breakthroughs, and grand plans. And the wider the gap grows between these two realities, the louder the Kremlin has to repeat its favorite phrase, "Everything is under control."
And while the Russian system is falling apart, Putin's main ally has urgently switched sides to China, leaving the Kremlin alone to face its catastrophe. After a closed-door conversation with the dictator, Lukashenko dropped everything and rushed to Xi Jinping. For Moscow, this visit was a crushing blow and a personal insult. What happened behind closed doors, and why is Lukashenko cowardly betraying Putin? Watch right now in our report.
He abandoned Putin and went to negotiate with China. What happened during the talks between the old friends? Putin and Lukashenko spent 2 days behind closed doors, but after the meeting, something very strange happened. There were no traditional embraces in front of the cameras, no joint statements about brotherly nations, not even the usual parade of staged photographs that for years were meant to show the world the unbreakable friendship between Moscow and Minsk. Instead, there was almost complete silence. And for authoritarian regimes, silence after negotiations often says much more than dozens of official communiques. The thing is, right now Putin doesn't need compliments or diplomatic courtesies from Lukashenko. The Kremlin needs Belarus as a military resource, as territory, as a staging ground, as yet another tool to continue the war. After Russia lost a huge amount of equipment, people, and time, Moscow is increasingly returning to the old idea of using the Belarusian direction for renewed pressure on Ukraine, while simultaneously keeping NATO's eastern flank on edge. But it seems that this time Lukashenko did not want to be the person who would personally open the door to a new major escalation. According to analysts, the issue of using Belarusian territory may have been the main topic of the negotiations. Judging by the outcome, Minsk's response turned out to be extremely unpleasant for the Kremlin. It is especially interesting that this whole story is unfolding just a few days after another very telling episode. Lukashenko essentially confirmed that he had switched off the relays that the Russian side was using to coordinate drone attacks. Moreover, he openly stated that Belarus should not be drawn into the war. For a person who for years had demonstrated almost unconditional loyalty to the Kremlin, such statements are more than eloquent. And then things got even more interesting. Hardly had the difficult negotiations with Putin ended when Lukashenko almost immediately appeared in Beijing. Such a rapid arrangement of a meeting with Xi Jinping has already been called a separate signal by many experts. When, after a difficult conversation in the Kremlin, a person's first move is to fly to the Chinese leader, it looks like an attempt to find a very influential interlocutor and, at the same time, a very serious safety net. In Beijing, Lukashenko heard exactly what he wanted to hear. China has officially declared its support for the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of Belarus. For diplomats, this is a standard formula. For the Kremlin, however, this is very unpleasant news, since China has, in effect, drawn a line. Belarus must remain a separate state and not turn into yet another military testing ground for the implementation of someone else's plans. And here Putin found himself in a rather awkward situation. Just a few years ago, Moscow could almost unilaterally dictate the rules of the game to Minsk. Today, however, Lukashenko has gained a powerful external resource for maneuvering. While the Kremlin demands greater involvement in the war, China reminds everyone about stability, trade, transit corridors, and economic interests. And for Minsk, money and logistics have recently sounded much more convincing than yet another military adventure. Beijing has a very simple reason not to allow Belarus to be drawn into a new round of war. For decades, China has been building transport routes to Europe, investing in the Belarusian economy, and viewing Minsk as an important hub for its presence on the continent. The opening of any new front would mean the risk of border closures, new sanctions, and the destruction of part of these plans. And for the sake of the Kremlin's fantasies about another march on Kiev, the Chinese leadership clearly does not intend to sacrifice its own interests. Another aspect is no less painful for Moscow. Lukashenko has long since learned how to survive among bigger players. For years, he balanced between the West and Russia. Now, he is increasingly adding China into this equation. In fact, the Belarusian leader is demonstrating that even under the current circumstances, he is capable of saying no to the Kremlin and not ending up alone. It is no coincidence that political analysts call Lukashenko a political weather vane. He rarely takes risks unless absolutely necessary. He almost never sides with the party that, in his opinion, might lose. If Lukashenko is now increasingly showing caution toward the Kremlin's plans, this may indicate something very important. Even among Russia's closest circle, fewer and fewer people are willing to tie their future to Putin's policies. And this story may go far beyond the Belarusian issue. If China is indeed beginning to play a more active role in the processes surrounding the war, if Beijing is increasingly openly demonstrating its own red lines and the Kremlin's allies are more and more often seeking support there, then Moscow is gradually losing its monopoly on influence even in those countries it considered its own backyard just yesterday. And while Russian propaganda continues to talk about the unity of its allies, reality itself is presenting completely different scenarios. One dictator spends 2 days in the Kremlin, refuses the most important requests, and then flies to Xi Jinping for political protection. For Moscow, this does not look like a show of strength. For Moscow, it looks like a very alarming sign that even its closest partners are paying more and more attention to a future without Putin.
And what do you think about these events? Write your thoughts in the comments, leave a like, and stay up to date with the main news. There's more to come.